Hi. This video goes out to MackQuigley and DanMill23. It's in regards to one of MackQuigley's videos, number 59, Squashing Godless Creationism. He asked 16 questions to be answered. Obviously he wanted simple numbers for these questions so that he could crunch the numbers himself. I'm going to do a little bit more than that and actually comment on the questions themselves and what they mean, as well as crunch the numbers myself. And on that point, I want to point out that I'm being very general with these numbers. I'm not doing very specific calculations. It's late. I don't really feel like doing them, so I'm not. But I do try to hedge on the low end so that, it actually hedges that towards the creationist argument instead of towards the actual fact of evolution and the theory of evolution. So let's do it that way. So let's start with this first question. How many DNAs, and there's quotes on that I put there on myself, are involved at each mutation? I think what he means here is how much of the genome is affected by a mutation. Like how many genes, how many codons, how many base pairs. Now, that's really difficult to really quantify because there are several different types of mutation. We can average it out to about, for eukaryotes, about 10 to the negative fifth mutations per generation, per base pair. And a generation in this sense is the direct line descendant of the parents. So in this case, a generation is an individual, not simply, a million individuals from a million parents. But I have to mention here also that when it comes to mutations, there are several different types. There are small-scale mutations. Some are known as point mutations, which are single base pair changes. Insertions, which add one or two base pairs in a genome. Deletions, which remove base pairs from a genome. There are large-scale mutations, such as gene duplications, which copies large sections of the genome. Gene deletions, which remove large sections of the genome. Chromosomal translocations, which move different parts of the genome to other parts of the genome. And chromosomal inversion, which literally flip the genome around. Some of these obviously would be very bad. Some of them are fairly neutral, and some of them are beneficial. Now, the ones I'm dealing with here, I just deal with the average of base paired mutations, and this is what I'm going to use when I do my little calculations and stuff later on. And that's just an average. It doesn't really say what happens when a mutation occurs. Now, for bacteria and humans and some other eukaryotes, the mutation rate is lower, so I'll deal with those specific mutation rates at other times. But for most eukaryotes, it ranges about 10 to the negative fifth base pair mutations per generation. So, the next one, number 2. Rate that mutations normally occur in gamete cells. Well, again, it can vary, but for eukaryotes, it's 10 to the negative fifth mutations per gamete per generation, per base pair. Pretty much answered in the previous question. I mean, question number 1 and number 2 are really closely related, so the answers are going to be like that, and that happens with several of these questions. And if you're wondering, the facial hair, I'm looking kind of scruffy from some of my other videos. Well, I'm going to be going fishing in the mountains come Thanksgiving, so I'm growing out some facial hair and stuff to keep my face warm in what's likely to be cold weather. I do this quite often when I go camping. I'll just let myself go. Okay, number 3, rate of non-lethal mutations. That's about 99%. well, it's between 95 and 99%. Most mutations are neutral. The following mutations, even the beneficial ones are obviously beneficial, and the deleterious ones are not necessarily lethal. They may reduce reproductive success, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will kill an organism. So I'm assuming here by non-lethal he means specifically mutations that shut down the genetic machinery of the cell at some point, killing the organism. So it's about 95 to 99% of the mutations are non-lethal. Continuing on, number 4. Rate of neutral mutations. Well, I just mentioned that. It's about 95%. It can range up to 99% depending on the species you're looking at. And he seems to talk, we need to talk about value judgments when it comes to mutations here. Because some mutations, we call them beneficial, or we call them deleterious, or we call them neutral. But that has to do with the environment they're currently in and the selective pressures for that environment. The truth is, whether a mutation is beneficial, deleterious, or neutral depends on selective pressures. So if those selective pressures change, the nature of that mutation, or the beneficial, deleterious, or neutral nature of that mutation changes. So a good example is using the old standby, the English pepper moth. On average, for this pepper moth, if it's in a region with light trees, light stones, stumps, whatever it tends to rest on, and it's the light allele for that moth will tend to be beneficial. Now, if it's in an environment where it's generally darker, I mean darker by the hue of the background, not necessarily light, the dark colored allele will tend to be beneficial. And both of these alleles in the wrong environment are detrimental. So, it really depends on the environment. And other mutations, like, say, the number of wing scales on the moth's wings can be completely irrelevant to the situation and to the environment, so, or at least irrelevant in the case of dealing with light versus dark colored environments. Now, let's deal with an interesting thing here. So, as to whether or not a mutation will be deleterious, neutral, or beneficial, depends on the environment and selective pressures in that environment. This is a concept that's very important to understand and retain if you wish to speak about the evolutionary process. If you don't understand it, or you don't retain it, you will make grievous errors in talking about what is beneficial, deleterious, or neutral when it comes to selective pressures and mutations. And you may just assume that all mutations are either beneficial, deleterious, or neutral, and that they don't change, or the nature of their survivability, of the adaptation potential, doesn't change. Okay. Continuing on. Number 5, likelihood of beneficial mutations occurring. That's about 1 in 100, give or take. There are about 2.5 times 10 to the negative 8th mutations per base pair per generation in humans. So that means each one of us carries around about 150 mutations in our gametes. Most of those mutations are completely benign. They do nothing to harm you or your children.